Get Rich Education is brought to you by Ridge Lending Group, the Real Asset Investor, and Corporate Direct. Cash flow real estate investors, this is Get Rich Education's Keith Weinhold. Did you know that you can finance up to 35 income properties, all with one lender? Ridge Lending Group specializes in investment property loans, and they do it in almost every U.S. state. Ridge has worked with tens of thousands of real estate investors and homeowners all over the country. They've been doing this for investors for so long that at this point, they've helped more families realize their dreams of becoming real estate investors than any other mortgage lender in the country. To find out more, visit ridgelendinggroup.com.
Welcome to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, giving you information and ideas on the investment that has turned more ordinary people into millionaires and billionaires than anything else, and can provide you with more wealth and happiness than you ever thought possible. Now, here's your host, investor, entrepreneur, business owner, and educator, Keith Weinhold.
Hey, welcome to GRE. You are inside Get Rich Education, episode 114. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, back to help you build your wealth here on a Star Wars Rogue One opening day. There's a second reason to be grateful today. The incomparable Peter Zeihan returns to Get Rich Education. We're going to talk about United States geography and geopolitics and how that affects your real estate investing today. The first time Peter was here on episode 101, we talked more globally. Today, it's U.S.-centric. So we're going to go region by region and state by state across the U.S. as we start in the Northeast and then move south and west. And you'll certainly be like drawing a map inside your head as you're listening, especially later in the show here. This is hugely important stuff to your future as an investor and in real estate investing because the market is more important than the property in real estate investing. I'm not going to talk much today as I'll just sort of lead Peter around. He joins us from his hometown of Austin, Texas today. Our guest today is a geopolitical strategist. What does that mean? Well, for one thing, he's a global energy, demographic, and security expert, and his career has ranged from working for the U.S. State Department in Australia to the Washington, D.C. think tank community to helping develop analytical models for Stratfor. You might have heard of them. They're one of the world's premier private intelligence companies. In 2012, he founded his own firm, Zeihan on Geopolitics, to provide a select group of clients with these sort of custom analytical products. And his clients today range from really a vast array of sectors, including financial institutions, energy majors, business associations, agricultural interests, universities, and the U.S. military. His freshman book, The Accidental Superpower, debuted in 2014. Welcome back to Get Rich Education, Peter Zeihan.
It is my pleasure.
Yeah, it's great having you back. Now, Peter, your popular book, The Accidental Superpower, and really a lot of your premise kind of revolves around the fact that I'll just say that it sort of makes the case for United States exceptionalism or even United States supremacy. And one of those reasons is that the United States has been lucky geographically. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, the single most important factor is the greater Mississippi system. As folks in agriculture or manufacturing know, moving things from A to B can be a bit of a disaster. But if you can float them, it's about 1/12 the cost. And if you take just the greater Mississippi waterway system, that's 13,000 miles of waterway. You take all of the American systems, you're now pushing 18,000. That's more than the rest of the planet put together. And if you can move things from A to B easily, then setting up your supply chains internally is not just secure, but it's cheap. And you can have a continental economy completely divorced from the rest of the global system that is actually globally competitive. And in areas where the United States has chosen to use its network, it has experienced not just the most rapid growth of its history, but the most rapid expansion and overall global power of its history.
Yeah, and luckily we have this geographic juxtaposition where this great inland waterway is kind of superimposed on top of our great agriculture region. And I think some people don't understand the power of an inland waterway versus the power of a coastline. Where an inland waterway, you kind of have two quote-unquote coasts, if you will, one on either side that you can serve as ports. And with an inland waterway, you're also hedged from tidal influence and storms and some other things. So a lot of people don't think about rivers, but you really do a great job in kind of playing up why it is so significant to what's made the United States a great success.
And if you think about the three most important things in any person's life, food, energy, construction, all of those are bulk materials that have a relatively low value for the amount of size that they have. It's not like computers where you can fit them into a small box and maybe airship them out. All three of these things that you use every day can be transported most effectively via the water. And you're right, those riverways happen to overlap almost perfectly the portion of the continent that is temperate and that is agriculturally productive. So you'll get your major cities at the mouths of the rivers, at the heads of the navigation, or where two rivers come together. And most American cities are in such locations.
Do you have any more broad geographic themes before a little bit later we get down and break down things into region and state, Peter?
Well, the last big check is that in addition to having this great land and water network, the United States is also pretty isolated from the rest of the planet. To the north is Canada, but it's separated by forests and lakes. To the south is Mexico, but it's separated by mountains and desert. And then ocean moats on both sides. In addition to being the absolute richest chunk of territory on the planet, the territory that comprises the United States is also the most securable. You put those two together, and the United States cannot help but be a global power.
Now, besides being lucky geographically, you also contend that the United States has been well positioned and is going to continue to be prosperous because we're lucky demographically. Tell us more.
Well, you got to think about how you live your life and how you have lived your life and how your parents lived their lives. People act differently, spend differently, invest differently based on their age. So when you're in your 20s and your 30s, it's primarily about consuming. You're raising kids, you're buying cars and houses and going to college. All of that costs a lot of money, but you're at the low point of your income. So you have to borrow. High growth from all that consumption, and that's most of the economic activity in the modern system, but also very high debt. Your second group, people in their 40s and 50s, the kids are moving out, the house is being paid down. They're probably going to have fewer cars rather than more cars. Consumption has tapered off, but incomes are at the highest of their life. They're both saving for retirement and paying a great deal of taxes. So this is the velocity of money, the investment dollar. This is how the government functions. And then finally, you have your retirees. You can't take the volatility, so they're stepping back from the financial world. All those stocks and bonds that they invested in to prepare for retirement are cashed in steadily and turned into T-bills and cash. In addition, they start drawing from the system in terms of pensions and health care in ways that they've never done before. So you normally have a very small retiree class, a mid-sized mature worker class, and a very large young worker base. This is traditionally a very inflationary system because you've got a lot of consumers there at the bottom of the demographic period and only a moderate supply of capital providers. So costs of capital are relatively high. It's just an issue of supply and demand. There aren't enough 50-somethings to supply all of the capital that the 20-somethings would like. That's how it's been since time immemorial, really since about the 14th century. But in the last 40 years, things have flipped. In the last 40 years, we have had a baby bust across the entire developed world. And in most countries, there are now more 50-somethings than 40-somethings than 30-somethings than 20-somethings than teenagers than children. And this has completely turned the capital structure on its ear. With all these 50 and 40-somethings, there is a capital surplus globally. All of the people in this age class, these are baby boomers, are investing so much money that they've driven down the rate of return in pretty much anything you can imagine. And if you think back to all the economic bubbles we've had in the last 15 years, you can lay all of those firmly at the feet of the boomer class. So everything from Enron to the brick boom to subprime. It's because the cost of capital has been artificially low. But there's a sunset date on this because all the boomers are about to retire. In fact, we've already been seeing them march into retirement for a decade. And by the time we get to about 2022, the vast majority of them will have taken that plunge. And instead of saving for retirement, they'll be retired. And all of that money ceases flowing into the system, ceases going into high productivity investments. And the generation that's coming up behind them, Generation X, is tiny in comparison. Go down a little bit further, you hit the millennials. High consuming generation, lots of consumption. And so we're going to go from this world where the boomers are providing capital to the Xers, large generation providing capital to a small one, cost of capital are low. And it's just a few short years that flips, and Gen X will providing capital to Gen Y, small generation providing capital to a large one. The cost of capital is going to at least triple. But what's really crazy is that in the United States, our baby boomers actually had kids. That's why the millennial class is so large. But if you look at the rest of the world, that did not happen. So if you think about things like the European financial crisis or the Chinese financial crisis or the Japanese financial crisis, those are happening because these areas are trying to come to terms with their retiring boomer class. But there's no replacement generation coming up. So capital is as cheap as it's going to be, and consumption is as high as it's going to be for at least the next 40 years. The U.S. doesn't have to deal with that. We've got a 15-year bump where we have to digest the boomer retirement, and then we get more or less back to normal because there's a lot of millennials. Everywhere else, that's not the case. So we're in this weird moment in history right now where the United States is the world's largest financial and largest consuming power. And in just 15 years, the United States will be the world's only financial power and only consuming power.
Your demography is your destiny, and people and the migration of people and their consumption patterns just tie in so much to where the prosperous places are going to be and where the prosperous real estate is going to be. And industry and influence changes over time. For example, we're talking about the shale boom a lot more now for the United States than we were 10 to 15 years ago when we were hardly talking about it at all. And that ties into demography as well. I was watching one of your videos on Zion.com where you basically stated that a 30-year-old, they drive to work and they drive their kids to soccer practice. A 50-year-old only drives to work, and a 70-year-old doesn't drive to either place. So it's not so much sometimes a question of how much production will we have with the shale oil boom. For example, demographics factor in because really the question is, will we have sufficient consumption as the millennials grow up in sort of this weird time, like you mentioned? Now, Peter, if you're about set, I'd love to just go ahead and talk about region by region and even state by state about the United States and just what economies look to be prosperous and just which places are positioned geopolitically to be more and less prosperous here in the, I guess, near to intermediate term future, if you're ready to do that?
Absolutely. You're primarily interested in residential real estate, correct?
Yeah, this is mostly through a filter of the residential real estate investor, which place is going to be prosperous and which won't be. Because, of course, when a place is prosperous, that helps out a real estate investor in a few ways at the same time. Number one, of course, that property is most likely to appreciate. Number two, that property is more likely to be occupied when you're an investor and you rent that to somebody else. And then thirdly, your rent income is most likely to increase as well.
I agree with you completely. I just want to first go through a couple of other topics that are impinging upon the real estate market that are separate maybe from what you're thinking of, that are more geopolitical in origin. We'll definitely spend a lot of time on the question of who's going to be economically prosperous, but there's a couple of things that I think are front-loading some of the discussion right now.
Okay, let's do that.
Sure. Right now, we're at a moment where the global trade system is breaking down. You combine that with the global demographic bust and what is probably going to be a major energy crisis in the next few years, that's a whole separate topic. And you're already seeing big waves of capital flight flooding out of Japan, China, and the European Union in particular, but really the entire developed and developing world. And there are very few places this capital could go because the capital wants to go to places where rule of law is sacrosanct and where the political culture encourages economic growth. And the entirety of the money tends to go into just a handful of places. In escalating order of size, that's New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States. because those are the only places in the world that meet those criteria. And the reason the United Kingdom is third and not second, quite simply, is because of Brexit. There's a lot of uncertainty in the UK now, so it's kind of lost its preeminent center as a money processing facility. When that money comes into Anglo-America, it really only goes into the gateway cities, and there are only 8 of them. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver in Canada, and in the United States, Santa Monica, San Francisco, Seattle, New York City, and Miami. Now, I don't want to denigrate the economic capacity of the gateway cities. They're all dynamic places with a lot going on. But when it comes to residential property, you are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars flooding into one specific subsector and massively distorting everything that's going on in those markets. Until about 2 months ago, the market that was by far the most distorted was Vancouver, and it was bidding up local residential property prices to such a degree that locals who did not already own property could never enter the market. And anyone who was a renter was being forced out. So Vancouver is in the process of becoming a ghost town because none of the locals can afford to live there anymore. It's all capital flight that isn't smart money. It's not sophisticated money. It just wants to find a place where rule of law applies, preferably with a pre-existing population of whatever ethnic group happens to be sending the money over. So in the case of Vancouver, primarily Korean and Chinese money. Now, in Vancouver, they put in a couple of foreign taxes to penalize the foreign money that's coming in. And most importantly, they put in an empty occupancy tax. And this has started to divert a lot of that cash to secondary cities elsewhere or other gateway cities. But it's probably too little too late. And if you look at places like Vancouver or Toronto, at night you will notice how dark those buildings are. So the geopolitics are encouraging high property prices in these areas, but it's high property prices not based on what I consider to be the right reasons. It's erratic, it's unstable, it's determined by outside forces, and all it takes is a local quirk, whether that's in regulation or circumstance or politics, and that money just goes away. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but it will. So when you're looking at the gateway cities, you have to keep that in mind. Places like New York are probably a little bit more resilient to this than places like Toronto because they've got a broader-based economy and it's a larger system. But even in places like New York and Miami, you have to keep that in mind. So that's factor one. Gateway cities, lots of growth in property, but it doesn't match the fundamentals of the local market. Second group of cities is more along the idea that you've identified. I call them the reinvented cities. These are places where in the last 20, 25 years, the local government, either through happenstance or some really wise policies, have managed to redefine how the locals think of themselves and redefine how everyone in the region thinks of the city. And they've brought in a lot of investment. They've changed their tax policies. They've changed the way they work with organized labor. And they've managed to attract a lot of new industries to generate growth in an organic way that to a certain degree takes advantage of America's strengths geographically, America's strengths demographically, and a lot of the global weakness that is starting to punch in. There's probably about 20 of these overall. The big four that I think are emblematic of this shift are Oklahoma City, Austin, Texas, Salt Lake City, and Charleston, South Carolina. The reason I picked those four is because they've had a complete shift in the type of industries that tend to set up shop in the cities in just the last couple of decades. And they've seen a strong economic boom since. In all four cases, the housing boom and bust that hit in 2007, for the most part, passed these places by because the growth was broad-based, rooted in good policy, and rooted in income growth. Not like what you saw in places like Orlando or East LA or Phoenix or Las Vegas. These are places that got the policy right. And then the third category are places that maybe aren't growing right now, but I think will. They need a policy change, but they've got good bones, and most importantly, the river cities, so they can take advantage of that transport system. One of the things that's happening globally right now is a breaking down of really sophisticated, hundred-of-step-long supply chains in favor of a much more simplistic system where the production is much closer to the end user. North America has by far been the biggest beneficiary of this trend, and if the river cities can take advantage of that trend, they've got the lowest internal transport costs. So think of places like St. Louis, Savannah, Albany, Memphis, Mobile, Baltimore. All of those places are perfectly positioned at intersections of major natural transport arteries, and in most cases, major artificial transport arteries. So whether it's road, rail, water, or air, these places are very well positioned.
Yeah, and a number of these are lower cost of living places, which seems to be a migration trend in the United States, that more people are locating to lower cost of living, more tax-friendly jurisdictions and away from the coasts at times.
Exactly, and that really overlays with the demographic question. We've all known for years that the millennials like to take a decade off for some extended adolescence. Well, a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, the youngest millennials graduate from high school in 2018. This generation's grown up. Half of them are in their 30s now. That means that extended adolescence is over. And so this big urge that they all had in their 20s to move to the coast and live in a big city, well, they're now coming face to face with life. A lot of them are discovering that things like mortgages and pregnancy and, dare I say, marriage are now their norm. And this means they are moving out of Boston and San Francisco and Santa Monica and New York and Miami into communities that have lower costs of living where they can, establish adult lives. They're also not nearly as liberal as we thought. Now, in the last two elections for President Obama, the millennials were 4 and 8 years younger. So obviously he pretty much swept that class. This time, with a lot of them in their 30s, that wasn't the case. They're growing up. They're becoming more conservative. They have something to lose. 45% of them voted for Trump. And so they're moving away from those exciting big cities on the coast and into the somewhat, I don't mean this pejoratively, but slightly more boring cities where they can actually have an adult life. And so what I do is I look for cities where these trends overlap to a certain degree. Cities with good policies that have reinvented themselves, river cities where long-term economic potential is very high, and low cost of living but relatively high quality of life, so the millennials are more interested in moving to them. And it's a pretty long list. You got places like Chicago or Pittsburgh or Houston, Louisville, Sacramento, Nashville, the Quad Cities of Iowa and Illinois. These are all places where the millennials are flocking, where the rivers are navigable and where land prices are cheap. And you're seeing all of these places at the early stage of what is likely to be at least a 2-decade boom.
Yeah, the economic realities sure are shaping the largest age cohort this country's ever seen. That's the millennials, and sometimes it comes down to something rooted in geography like navigable rivers, and those millennials don't even have any idea that is often an underlying reason why they've moved to where they've moved to. Well, when Peter and I come back, we're going to talk region by region and even state by state at which places look to be economically prosperous, especially when we think about residential real estate investment. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is Peter Zeihan. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. As a lot of investors know, multifamily real estate has been one of the best asset classes to be invested in most of the last decade. While the great deals have been harder to find lately, there are still opportunities in select markets where savvy investors can get lots of appreciation and strong cash flow if you have a great team. Dave Zook, founder and president of The Real Asset Investor, and his team have been very active in the multifamily space in Memphis, Tennessee. On the heels of the Great Recession of 2009, Dave and his team quietly started acquiring multifamily assets, and in the last few years, he has syndicated over 2,000 apartment units, creating strong cash flow streams and big appreciation for lots of their investors. It's not too late to get involved. If you're an accredited investor and you would like to learn more about investing in great multifamily apartments with a world-class team, email Dave and his team at info@therealassetinvestor.com.
You've worked hard to acquire real estate. Don't lose it in a blue instant. We live in a litigious society. Assets must be protected. Rich Dad advisor Garrett Sutton founded Corporate Direct to provide strong and effective asset protection for all investors in America. Corporate Direct offers personalized attention to your specific situation and is very affordable. Call 800-600-1760 and mention Get Rich Education for a $100 discount on all formations. Garrett Sutton wrote Loopholes of Real Estate, Start Your Own Corporation, and Toxic Client, among other bestsellers. He and his experienced team at Corporate Direct want you to be protected right now and with proper corporate maintenance into the future. Visit corporatedirect.com today for a free incorporation kit or call 800-600-1760 for your Get Rich discount. That's corporatedirect.com at 800-600-1760.
This is the Real Wealth Network's Kathy Fettke, and you are listening to the always valuable Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education with our guest, Peter Zeihan from Zeihan on Geopolitics, ZEIHAN.com. So, Peter, let's talk about the economic fortunes, the prosperity, and the geopolitical positioning about a few regions and states of the U.S. Why don't we start in New England, where, at least our non-indigenous peoples sort of started their settling. So let's start there with the 6-state New England region. Can you speak to that?
You got to start with the one that I don't think too highly of. New England is probably the region that is going to suffer the most in the United States from the changes that are happening nationally and internationally. This is an area that is not a natural attractor of capital because local regulations tend to be pretty strict. Also, local geography is a little rough. It's difficult to get economies of scale. There were a lot of people who moved into this region to take advantage of the New York boom, because when all the millennials moved to New York, people had to move out to the suburbs and then the exurbs and then elsewhere in New England to take advantage of it. Now that that trend is reversing, you're going to see a lot of the people who moved to Connecticut moving back to Manhattan. And when that happens, these areas are going to see their tax base shrink at the same time the baby boomers are removing themselves from the market. That will happen at the same time that these states, because of the red-blue split, have their own regulations shifting in a direction that's actually going to dissuade new people from moving in because of tax rates. So all of the major trends are working against these places right now.
Yeah, and that's already a region that's seen a lower real estate price appreciation than some other regions of the country. Let's move to its neighbor, New York. New York's a state where you have this great dichotomy between upstate and western New York rural geography and New York City. What do we see for New York?
New York City itself is, of course, a beast, and it's going to be a global financial hub no matter what happens. In fact, because of the way Brexit is going, it looks like it's going to be a very hard Brexit. So I would estimate that at least 1/3 of the jobs that currently exist in the UK financial sector are going to pick up and relocate to New York City. Might even be more. So you combine that with the capital flight question, and New York will always have a high degree of churn and a lot of buildup. I'm not saying there won't be corrections. Lord knows one is needed right now. But of the 8 North American gateway cities, New York is by far the most stable in terms of that inward flow. The mayor and the state both understand what makes New York work, and there's a strong consensus, Democrat, Republican, in order to preserve what makes New York special and functional. So corrections, yes, but it's still going to be a loud, busy, profitable place. Elsewhere in the state, you're going to see a lot of millennial flow, especially when you're talking about moving up the Hudson River, particularly to places like Albany and Schenectady. I can never pronounce Schenectady. Anyway, the axis of cities from Albany to Buffalo, I think is going to see a lot of growth in the not too distant future. As things like telecommuting become ever more popular, these are places that young millennials can move and still have access to all of the hubbub of New York City without being too far away. So I'm pretty bullish on all of New York State for a mix of reasons.
How about the state to the south of New York, a state where I was born and lived most of my life, Pennsylvania? I think of a lot of things with Pennsylvania, particularly maybe the Marcellus shale oil boom. Speak to Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania is a great example of a state that's gotten everything half right. They've been encouraging of energy, and so the ability to produce stuff in large quantities there is legion. But the regulatory structure and everything outside of energy has gone completely the opposite direction. So Pennsylvania is providing oil and natural gas and propane and all the other derivative products that come out of the ground to their neighboring states, but they have proven absolutely incapable of capturing that product and moving up the value-added scale with things like chemicals and refining. It's gotten so bad that they're actually building pipelines that are 1,500 miles long to run the natural gas through the southeast to gasify the entire region, or west around the Appalachians to Houston, where it's fueling the chemical industry, because they can't get the regulations amended to the point that anyone wants to build the facilities in Pennsylvania itself. So yes, cost of living is relatively low if you look at the mechanics. But when you add in the position of organized labor and the regulatory question, Pennsylvania actually has some of the highest costs of living in the country. And until they can spread what they've done in the energy industry to other economic sectors, this is an area that is going to continue to hollow out from an industrial point of view.
Wow, that's really interesting. And maybe just before we leave Pennsylvania kind of away from the shale oil portion, one of the 5th or 6th largest metro areas, depending on how you classify it in the United States, what about the future fortunes for Philadelphia?
Philadelphia is probably an example of a city that has gotten almost everything wrong in the last 40 years. And if they, to be perfectly blunt, risk becoming the next Detroit.
The Eagles can't even win a Super Bowl.
Yeah. Now, on the opposite side of Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh's a great example of a city that's managed to completely reinvent themselves. It's one of the leading medical tech development cities, and if you've ever been in Pittsburgh in the last 10 years, you'll notice that the greater downtown area is completely revitalized.
Yeah.
Places that were slums in the River Valley 15 years ago are now home of condos and apartments that are bustling with young people. So it's not that Pennsylvania can't change. The problem is at the state house and the state government, and there's no place that's more emblematic of this dichotomy of low energy and high income from it, but the inability of translating that into something greater than Philadelphia. Well, I mean, Pittsburgh is a great example of a city that has shown you can make it work. And then Philadelphia is just on the flip side. I mean, here you've got a city that actually is a river city, but the policy has been so bad for so long, they can't even monetize what they've got with the energy sector.
Yeah, some people think Philadelphia is a coastal city, but it's not. It's on the Delaware estuary. It is, like you said, a river city.
Right.
Peter, in order to move this along a little bit better, why don't we take a wider chunk? Why don't we take the New Jersey coast all the way down through Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and both the Carolinas? I know that's a large region. You mentioned Charleston earlier. Any areas in there specifically positioned for a lot of prosperity or misfortune?
Well, the northern half of that is megalopolis. The whole area between New York City and D.C. There's obviously a lot of variation in policy region by region, but I see no reason why this area won't continue to grow simply because it is the heart of American urban areas. Now, keep in mind, with the Trump presidency, you are not going to see the sort of explosive growth in the greater D.C. area that we have seen for the last 8 years. That is probably going to plateau, might even fall back a little bit.
Interesting.
So be careful where in places like D.C. that you decide to put down roots, because you're not going to see billions upon billions upon billions of dollars of government investment going into this area like we've seen. And if you look at things like Crystal City, you can already see how urban decay is starting to creep in to a zone that used to be dominated by all these defense contractors and consultants, because the wars have wound up. And so just be aware of that. Still have a lot of population pressure, still a lot of people moving there, but you're not going to see the explosive activity that you've seen. Now, you move south of D.C., you get into the Chesapeake Bay area all the way down to Savannah. This is an area that is showing how northerners who have gotten fed up with quality of life and cost of living in megalopolis are discovering that they can telecommute or maybe plane commute by living in entirely different regions.
Yeah.
Charleston has not just reinvented themselves as a major city and a major manufacturing hub. You now actually have a community of Wall Street traders that live in New York City for 3 to 4 days a week and then fly home because they'd rather have their kids raised in a place where they can have a backyard. And to a lesser degree, you're seeing that on the North Carolina coast as well. And we're even in the early stages of seeing the economic dynamism of that coast starting to reach upstate into both Carolinas. Virginia, of course, Northern Virginia is going to be an echo of D.C. no matter what happens, but Richmond and Newport News are becoming bustling economic centers in their own right as a lot of that foreign manufacturing capacity starts to relocate back to the United States. And as the United States gets back into exporting of a lot of products, Norfolk looks great.
This is fascinating, and this is some great knowledge that you have here. And by the way, I have a map of the United States out, just an outline map of the 50 states while we're having this great discussion. Let's move a little bit further south into Georgia, including where we have Atlanta with the nation's busiest airport, where a lot of Fortune 500 companies have relocated and where we have a lot of colleges and universities. Just a few sentences on Georgia, Peter?
Georgia, you've got to split the two pieces, of course. Georgia, greater Atlanta, and then the coastal zones. Savannah now has what is the largest major port in the United States. They are making a bid for controlling all of the container traffic that enters to the U.S. seaboard. They've got a reasonable chance of being successful with that. But even if they're not successful, even if they only get a third of the total, that's still pretty massive. And local regulations are so much more favorable there than they are in a place like Miami. I have no doubt that this is an area that's going to grow pretty robustly, especially since Savannah is, to be perfectly honest, an awesome town. Atlanta's a great example of a state that has gotten most of it right. They have a very strong civic culture. They've got very good relationships with all the corporations that have now set up headquarters, and they're modifying their educational system in order to provide these industries with all the skilled labor that they might need, customized to their nest, whatever their desires are. However, they're not very good at urban planning. And so this reinvention that I've mentioned of a lot of cities like Charleston and Pittsburgh has yet to happen in Atlanta, which I've always found surprising because, here's a city of several million people that is headquarters to a dozen major global companies that just can't seem to solve its quality of life issue. Now, as soon as they do that, this is the next Chicago. But they've got to have that urban revitalization program that's really taken root in a lot of other cities. It just hasn't made it here yet. So when you're talking upside potential, Atlanta is a city that has already gotten all of the hard stuff right. Now they just need to do the easy stuff.
Let's talk about the Florida Peninsula. A lot of people think about Miami, but, Jacksonville and Orlando are two popular cash-flowing real estate markets. So just a few thoughts on Florida.
Baby boomers, baby boomers, baby boomers, they all want to move to Florida or Phoenix. So if you're okay with that, or if you feel you can make money off of that, you can thrive because this is a trend that's going to last for another 25 years. If you're looking for broad-based economic growth that is a little bit more varied, though, Florida is probably not the place you want to be looking at anytime soon. The one exception to the Florida rule is, of course, Miami. As the United States backs away from the global system and as most of the global system breaks down, there are a couple of regions that are going to do very well. One of those is Latin America. Because if you look at the entire Latin America system from the Mexican-U.S. border all the way down to Chile and Argentina, there is not going to be a single war of significance in that entire zone for the next 25 years. In addition, it is one of the few areas that the United States is likely to remain interested. Well, the gateway city for everyone in Latin America who isn't in Mexico, and we're talking here about over 800 million people, is Miami. It is definitely going to be one of the top three major immigration cities in the country, and it's a launching point, of course, for the big Cuban economic revolution that is just starting right now. So all of Florida might kind of feel like an old folks home, with the exception, of course, of Orlando and the Disney World. But Miami is going to be this massive global conglomeration of a city that is incredibly dynamic.
Yeah, what a juggernaut of influence, and there may be almost as much of a dichotomy between Miami and the rest of Florida as there is New York City and upstate New York. Well, Peter, let's move west a little bit into Alabama. The first time I had you on the show, you kind of marked Alabama as a place that has a lot of up-and-coming prosperity. And, I think a lot of people have misconceptions about Alabama. They think about it as some backwards place, but there are a lot of universities and there's a lot of technology there. Tell us about Alabama.
Let's start with what most people think of as a negative. When people think of the culture of Alabama in specific, or the South in general, they think of a political system where it's the good old boys network, where you get representatives of all the major players, whether it's the utility board, the taxman, the mayor's office, state reps, whatever, and they get together behind closed doors and they decide how things are going to be. And if you can't penetrate into that room, you don't have a chance of influencing things. And there's a certain degree of accuracy to that. And this is one of the things that has really retarded economic growth across the South for the better part of the last century. But this is how most of the world actually works. And what the Alabamans have discovered is if you take those people who are in that closed room and you put together a plan, you can then take that plan to Berlin or Seoul and pitch it to foreign companies that are looking to forward position their manufacturing footprint in the American market. And so the number one state in the country for inward direct investment from foreign companies is Alabama. It's not California or New York, it's Alabama. As a result, places like Mobile and Birmingham and Montgomery are rapidly becoming wildly diverse global economic hubs. And we're starting to see the impact from that trickle into every supporting sector across the region. Encouraging this massively is the fact that, remember all that Pennsylvania shale gas that's being pumped out because the Pennsylvanians can't figure out how to capture it in a meaningful way? A lot of that's coming into the South. And Southern Company, which is the major electricity company in the region, is in the process of switching from coal to natural gas across the entire region. That's not only improving air quality, it's actually driving down power costs because the shale gas is almost a waste product in most markets in the United States. So you're seeing this magic confluence of factors, good urban planning, good economic pitches, low energy prices, low land costs, all converging at the same time. Alabama is probably the quintessential southern state where it just seems to be working perfectly.
Let's talk about a state just to the north of it, Tennessee, where we kind of have Nashville toward the eastern end of the state. And then the southwestern corner of the state, we have Memphis. And Memphis, Tennessee, taking advantage of being on that intercoastal waterway, has long been touted as one of the best cap rate markets for real estate investors for a long time.
Something you have to remember about Tennessee is that just because you have rivers doesn't mean you're automatically going to be successful. It gives you the good bones, but policy matters. And when I think about places like Memphis or Nashville, or to go back to some of the regions we've already talked about, places like Baltimore, these are some places that have a lot of internal problems that haven't been able to really fully monetize where they are right now. I'm pretty hopeful on them in the future, but there's a couple of things that have to change. First, there's an issue of national policy. We've got a policy on the books right now in the United States called the Jones Act. It was passed during the Great Depression. It was a stimulus measure. And what it said was that any cargo vessel that transported goods between any two U.S. ports had to be American-owned, operated, captained, and crewed, and built. And if it didn't meet those criteria, it could not take cargo from one American port to the other. This steadily drove up cargo costs on American waterways, basically tripling to quadrupling them over the next 20, 30 years, and largely killing the American barge system. Memphis is a great example of a city that in the heyday was the entrepot for distribution and collection in the American system, that ever since the Jones Act has been kind of sliding downhill. Now, you repeal the Jones Act, you drop the cost of transport, and all of these river cities get a huge jump. So that's piece one. Piece two is local policy. Kind of like Atlanta, Memphis hasn't yet figured out how to leverage what it's got. Yes, it's a massive transport hub. Road, rail, air, water, it's all there. They haven't figured out how to solve a lot of the social and racial problems yet in a way that places like Atlanta have. And until they can do that, any growth that you see in places like Memphis are going to be largely dependent on outside factors. And in my opinion, that makes it a little bit shakier than it should be.
Yeah, that's really interesting commentary. Well, as we try to move faster, as we want to cover the whole country, why don't we just take one last wide region, the last region that we have east of the Mississippi River, and that's a big swath of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Just any broad thoughts on that five-state Great Lakes region?
A lot of these areas have more or less the same challenges that places like Memphis have. They've got great rivers, great water access. All the cities are trying to redefine themselves. Of the major cities in this region, I would say that the only ones that have really pulled that off successfully to this point are Louisville and Lexington in Kentucky. Relatively low taxes, relatively good internal racial relations. Their downtown areas are both in the process of being revitalized. You don't see that degree of reinvention at present in Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois. Obviously, Chicago is its own exception. They've got what they need. The millennials are moving back. That will help with the revitalization, but they're just not there yet.
What about Missouri? We have St. Louis in the east. We have Kansas City in the west, both of those known as cash flowing real estate markets. Any thoughts on Missouri?
St. Louis has exactly the same problem as Memphis and Indianapolis. The bones are good, but they need a revitalization. Kansas City is a little bit different. Kansas City, you're in the I-35 corridor, which is at present the great manufacturing highway of the United States system. That manufacturing impulse hasn't quite made it to Kansas City yet. Right now, I would say it's kind of capped at Oklahoma City. But no matter what happens in the next few years with the Trump administration, either Mexico City will continue to be part of the American manufacturing network, in which case Oklahoma City's in the middle and it will stretch up to Kansas City, Des Moines, and Minneapolis, or the United States will turn more protectionist. Mexico will get cut out of the system, and the jobs that used to be in Mexico, after a fashion, will migrate to these northern portions of the I-35 corridor, where land prices and labor prices tend to be cheaper than they are in Texas.
What about Arkansas and what about Louisiana and New Orleans being so interesting in the future of New Orleans in a post-Katrina world and this below sea level city? So any thoughts about Arkansas and Louisiana?
Arkansas, the terrain is very difficult, and it's just hard to get an economy of scale, in my opinion. I don't mean to suggest that there's nothing going on there, but it's really hard to draw any broad conclusions when the pockets of population are so separated by geography. New Orleans, of course, is its own little monster. The biggest problem that New Orleans is going to be having over the next 30 years is whatever is going to happen with sea levels. You've got a double bind there. Number one, as the Mississippi is really trying to change course, you're leading to land settlements as the land itself is subsiding and depressing. Second, of course, is if the folks that are in the global warming camp are correct, you're looking at more storms and you're looking at higher sea levels. And for a city that's below sea level already, that's a real problem. Now, you can take chunks of New Orleans, like the French Quarter, that are actually above sea level. They'll do very well. The port is fine. But a lot of those supporting surrounding communities are probably not viable in the long term. So if you're going to invest in this region, it's very important to look at not just a physical geography map and an economic geography map, but an elevation map. Because we've seen what happens if they just have one day where it goes wrong.
Right. It isn't often that you're looking closely at topographic lines when you're considering where to invest in real estate, but you might very well be doing that there in Louisiana, where geography and climatology have kind of an outsized effect there as you get closer to the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana. Well, what about, Peter, the big Texas juggernaut? Let's talk about Texas, where you have business-friendly tax incentives, a big influx of people, no state income tax, a low cost of living, a fairly central location. What do you have to say about Texas and Texas's future economic fortunes?
The Texas Triangle, and that's the area that links together Dallas-Fort Worth, Greater Houston, and San Antonio. It has almost 20 million people living in the urban centers, and about half of the remaining population of Texas is within the Triangle. You've got good infrastructure, you've got low cost of living, you've got low wage cost for both low and medium and high-skilled workers. It is definitely the most economically successful region for the last 20 years. Assuming that NAFTA continues in more or less its current form, it will be the most successful, economically viable portion of the United States for at least the next 20 to come.
Wow.
The biggest risk that Texas faces is if NAFTA is closed down, Texas is going to have to find a new economic partner. Because every supply chain that is based on the advantages of the Texas Triangle, that's cheap labor, cheap energy, cheap land, and low taxes, all of it is enmeshed with the Mexico City corridor going all the way from San Antonio all the way down to Mexico City. You remove NAFTA, it's going to be a huge hit to this region. It will bounce back because a lot of that stuff will pick up and move north of the border, and specifically north of the Texas Triangle to places like Oklahoma City, Kansas City. But that will still be a kick in the teeth for this region. Personally, I don't think that's going to happen. I'm pretty sure that some version of NAFTA is going to continue and that the Texas success story is going to continue as well. Remember, this is a state without an income tax. So you're still going to have a lot of inward mobility of population to take advantage of that.
Yeah, you live in the Texas Triangle. I recently spent more time there, and I think even without looking at the numbers and knowing about things like public policy and trade, just the anecdotal cranes in the air effect, all the construction cranes that you see in the air every time you're in a metro is quite telling on its own.
Something to keep in mind about Texas is it's not the South. You don't have that kind of schmoozy government system like we talked about with Alabama.
Right.
This is a state that prides itself on not being organized. The state legislature is starved of capital, it's starved of people, it's starved of taxes. The legislature only meets for 35 days every other year. And so this is a region that is largely incapable of attracting, or at least deliberately attracting, foreign direct investment. So everything about the Texas story is American homegrown. That makes it a lot more stable when we're talking about a world that's in flux. It might miss out on some of these investment booms of companies like Daewoo or Mercedes trying to relocate facilities to the United States. They're not going to go to Texas because the Southerners are just so much better at courting that. But anything that is American-based, Texas is where it's going.
Well, you already touched on Oklahoma City. We just need to move to a wide swath north of there, from Kansas, looping around to Minnesota, all the way out through the Dakotas. Any particular comments of that kind of upper Midwest or upper Great Plains region?
Yeah, the upper Midwest, you still have the river access, so they're waiting for policy to change. If you have the Jones Act change, this area is going to be a natural beneficiary, and it'll probably grow with Texas. You'll see this entire zone be integrated into the Texas supply chain system because you'll be able to access the entire upper Mississippi network. The one exception to that is, of course, North Dakota, and that's largely a story of the Bakken play. You're seeing a lot of growth, not just in places like Bismarck that are at the heart of the play, but places like Fargo that are able to benefit from all the tax receipts that are coming into the state. Fargo is becoming a significant metro region in its own right. The biggest problem that Fargo faces is that they really, really, really need to build a bypass for the Red River to solve their flooding problem. If they can do that, that's the only structural impediment on their growth at this point.
You touched on Salt Lake City's potential future prosperity earlier. Just give us a little bit on Denver and Salt Lake.
Denver and Salt Lake, despite the fact that they're both mountain towns, are miles away from each other in terms of political culture and economic viability. Denver is the western anchor of the American heartland. And as such, it is kind of the new Independence, Missouri of the world. You go to Denver when you're going to launch off into the wider West. It's conservative, but not too conservative. It's liberal, but not too liberal. It's Americana while being exotic. It has everything going from it from a cultural point of view, and it's one of those quintessential reinvented cities. And this is before pot became legal. So Denver, from a cultural and economic point of view, is broad-based, it's exciting, and it's growing. Salt Lake City has a lot going for it, but for completely different reasons. I hate to play the religion card here, but the fact that this is the headquarters of the Latter-day Saints Church or the Mormons really, really matters. It shapes the political culture in huge degrees, and it makes it the only truly internationalized interior city in North America, because it attracts converts from the world over and keeps its population very young and very diverse. It has by far the best demography in the country, specifically because of the LDS faith. People get married very early, on average at age 23. You don't see that in the rest of the country. Millennials, the rest of the country, you're talking 35, 36. And because of that, you have this huge bulk of highly educated people in a socially harmonious area. So anyone who wants to set up a company that requires a lot of high-skilled labor, this is the place you go because of religion. It's kind of backwards from the American experience, but it's proven to be very successful.
That's interesting. I've never thought of it that way. The largest truly international interior city in the nation. That's pretty remarkable. Let's move a little bit further southwest into the most arid parts of the Southwest. Let's talk about Nevada and Arizona, where, you just have a lot of trends the past few generations that have caused a great deal of population influx there, like the advent of affordable air conditioning. And like kind of building this island, if you will, in the desert, something that kind of defies or flies in the face of geography is the amazing growth of Las Vegas. And then we have Phoenix and water shortages all through there. So tell us a little bit about Nevada and Arizona.
Well, when you're talking Nevada and Arizona, you're largely talking about Las Vegas and Phoenix. Keep in mind that if you get outside of Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, and Reno, these are some of the poorest parts of the country because the geography is just so horrible. It's dry, it's highland, it's broken, there's no water transport whatsoever. You're completely restricted to not just air, but helicopter or road. The rail lines, for the most part, can't function in these areas. It's too steep. So let's just talk about Las Vegas and Phoenix, really. Las Vegas and Phoenix are not economic hubs. They are island cities for all practical purposes. All of what they need has to be imported from a long way away, most notably food and water. And this creates a constant upward pressure on prices. The only way that you can bring down the cost of living in these areas is to subsidize that import or achieve economies of scale. And to a certain degree, both cities have achieved both. Las Vegas has managed to steal water from places 300 miles away. Phoenix has the Central Arizona project in which the federal government basically subsidizes the existence of Phoenix. Should something happen to either of those projects, and there is a push in every other state in the Southwest to dismantle them, these cities cease to be economically viable. Now, I don't see that shift as imminent, but there is not just a constant economic and climatological challenge to these cities, but it's political as well at the national level. So you've got to keep that in mind. There is no Phoenix, there is no Las Vegas without federally subsidized water availability. Now, that said, when you're talking about economic sectors that tend to favor regions like this, you're primarily talking tourism and to a certain degree conferences. The country's not big enough for two of these. So right now, they've kind of split it. Phoenix has become the big conference town. Vegas has become the big tourist town. It's stable for now. Once the baby boomers retire, once the cost of capital goes up, these two places face some interesting structural challenges because most of the people who will be living in the greater Phoenix area are going to be retirees who don't vote in Phoenix. So the political power that they have does not encourage an ongoing federal relationship with Phoenix that benefits the city. As all these baby boomers retire and as the millennials become parents, I would expect Vegas to kind of top out. You remove international tourism from the mix because of global chaos, Las Vegas tourist destination doesn't look so hot. So both of these cities are about to need a reinvention, and it's not clear that there's a direction that they can go. All of the trends that have made them successful for the last 30 years are in the process of dying back. They're going to face some pretty severe challenges.
California is almost a nation unto its own. Maybe we can just principally focus on coastal California, which is the epitome of what I call a volatile real estate market where prices can spike high and then they can fall low in recessions. It's kind of the opposite of stable markets that you find in the interior USA. Some thoughts on California's future economic fortunes?
Well, San Francisco, of course, is a gateway city, and because of the height restrictions and rent control is one of the most erratic. If you are the kind of person who counts cards in Las Vegas, San Francisco is absolutely for you because you can play that market. And if you've got a little bit of nerve, you know that prices are going to bounce back because of all the foreign money that flows in and the fact that it's a game back. This is dangerous from a real estate point of view, but only in the short term. If you're willing to take the long-term view, you're going to be fine. The rest of the Bay Area is a little bit more normal, but the rest of the Bay Area has the political inclinations of San Francisco without the income of San Francisco. So you have to deal with urban blight. You have to deal with racial disputes. And you have to deal with it on an economic level that is a lot lower. So that's why everybody thinks San Francisco is really interesting, but Oakland's not. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion to draw.
Yeah.
Los Angeles is its own beast. As long as the air quality question does not bother you, Los Angeles is probably forever. It's not a gateway city. Well, I mean, parts of it are. Santa Monica is. But because it's so broad, it's relatively affordable by California terms. And most of the people who move to California find themselves living in Los Angeles because of that. That makes it a much more broad-based system, much harder to shake. It's not a place that I personally would ever want to live, but the sprawl is big enough that there are price points at multiple levels, and that helps a lot. Anyone who doesn't want to live in San Diego doesn't have a soul, in my opinion. But affording living in San Diego is, of course, the challenge. In addition to the fact that it's a great place to live, high quality of life, good urban planning, and the naval base, it's a border city. And no matter what happens with NAFTA, you're always going to have a big Mexican component. If NAFTA continues to be successful, San Diego is a manufacturing hub that links up with Tijuana. If Mexico is barred because of a NAFTA breakdown, you're going to see a big surge of Mexican population out of northern Mexico and into San Diego. So it's kind of a minor gateway city, but the right kind of minor gateway city. Population pressure rather than people just coming and buying properties in order to hide their money.
The Pacific Northwest, Washington and Oregon, they've seen some of the highest real estate price increases on a year-over-year basis lately. Tell us more about Washington and Oregon's geopolitical and economic fortunes for the next few years.
Well, first of all, the primary reason for those price increases is twofold. Number one, Seattle is a gateway city, so they're seeing the same pressure as the other gateway cities. And second, as Vancouver has restricted inward investment to try to get the price surges under control, Seattle and to a lesser degree Portland are two of the three primary replacement cities for that investment. So if you're Chinese money coming in, you don't want to risk Vancouver now. You either go to Toronto, Seattle, or Portland. Beyond that, I'm a little nervous about the Pacific Northwest. From a demographic point of view, it is the most aged part of the country. There aren't a lot of young people there anymore, despite how much fun Portland is. And because of the Jones Act, they're not able to make the most out of the river network, particularly the Columbia. Keep in mind that Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington are agricultural zones that are doing wildly well. But that is on the wrong side of the mountains. It really doesn't benefit the major urban centers on the west side of the mountains. So I think of Portland and Washington in a somewhat similar way that I think about Phoenix. The trends of the last 30 years have really helped these areas. Asian trade, the Western population movement, the millennials going to the coast, all of this has helped these cities. All of those trends are now dying back. Portland is attempting to deal with this by just being a very cool place. To be perfectly blunt, they're pirating a lot of the slogans that have made Austin successful, and they're trying to copy some of the things that Austin has done with its cultural evolutions. Rude, but, it works. Seattle is, of course, a big port, but because of the organized labor problem, you actually see a lot of independent shippers setting up their own shipping facilities to get away from the longshoremen. And that has put a cap on what Seattle and Tacoma can achieve in terms of being transshipment hubs. So it still looks good, but I'm worried, particularly about Seattle. Remember that Seattle is built, for all practical purposes, on an isthmus. That means you're going to be seeing water no matter where you go. That's why the views are so perfect. But it also means you could have the type of labor and real estate inflation that you can see in a place like San Francisco, but as cool as Seattle is, it's no San Francisco. So you combine the fact that it's a gateway city, you combine that with the fact that it's a high tax environment, that you're starting to see supplementary investment being diverted from Seattle, and you can see a big bubble forming in this town. And it is not clear that this model is sustainable for more than a few years.
Yeah, interesting commentary. Like a lot of others, I probably thought that the region was younger than it really is. Well, let's wrap up with Alaska and Hawaii, which are respectively the 49th and 50th states admitted to the Union, so it's only appropriate. And I got to tell you, Peter, I'm a little bit nervous being an Anchorage, Alaska resident, knowing about the price of a barrel of oil and what happened to it starting a few years ago. I'm a bit nervous about that one. Tell us about Alaska and Hawaii.
Well, with Alaska, the picture changes based on what the time frame you're looking at. In course of the next, let's call it 1 to 3 years, you have reason to be nervous. Shale costs are far lower in terms of their full cycle break even than any of the production in Alaska. As of January, we're probably going to have a full cycle break even price in the shale fields of about $40 a barrel. Alaska's are probably a minimum $50, and the shale price keeps going down. So in terms of cost competitiveness, Alaska is definitely not looking very good, and we all know that without oil, you're going to lose half the population of Alaska. That said, I expect to have a global energy crisis before too long. And when that happens, Alaska will have maybe still expensive oil to produce, but it is the only state in the country that can legally export crude if you have an oil export ban in place. I expect that oil export ban to come back in a vengeance. Otherwise, you'd see American gasoline prices skyrocket, which means Alaska can sell crude into a high-price, high-risk environment without taking any risk. Most of that crude would probably go to Japan and Korea. So I'm a little nervous about Alaska in the short term. In the long term, it looks phenomenal. Hawaii's for forever. A lot of the Hawaiians are upset with the degree to which the Japanese have bought up a lot of property. You're going to continue to see a lot of high-powered foreign investment coming in to monopolize whatever they possibly can. And as the world becomes a more chaotic place, Hawaii is a safe haven. The problem, of course, is for anyone who's actually from Hawaii, because the cost of living is only going to go up. It's not going to take part in the American shale revolution. It's too far away. It's exposed to global energy prices. It's exposed to global economic trends. So you're looking at a place that is going to be very volatile in terms of economic stability and the ability of just your average Joe to make it through the day. But real estate investment looks fantastic because of the chaos elsewhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. And an interesting state to wrap up on, as that's really one of the more geographically isolated places in the entire world, let alone the United States. Well, Peter, this has been fascinating, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners have their mental map open while they're listening to this show. So if any of you listeners are more interested in anything that Peter and I quickly touched on as we jumped around, again, his website, Zeihan on Geopolitics, I think it's fascinating, Zeihan.com, Zeihan. Peter, how can our listeners and those interested find out more about you with what you're doing with speaking and consulting?
The easiest way is just go to the website and request more information, Zeihan.com, Zeihan.com. In addition, if you're interested in the world writ large, there's a couple of books you might want to look at. The first one is The Accidental Superpower. It came out a couple of years ago. The new one, which comes out later this month, is The Absent Superpower, The Shale Revolution and a World Without America. And that goes into a lot of the chaos that's about to break across the world writ large, talks about the wars to come and how the Americans are going to handle it.
Peter, this has been just absolutely fascinating stuff. Thanks so much for coming back on to Get Rich Education.
My pleasure.
Oh, yeah, great. Well, sometimes it's just really good to get an angle from a non-real estate person. Most every region seemingly has both a challenge and an opportunity. Well, did I skip over your area? Well, then you can learn more at Zeihan.com. We had to skip a few areas. In 114 episodes, we just produced the longest show in Get Rich Education history. Are you an influencer at a regional or a national or a multinational corporation? Just think about the value that consulting with Peter would bring when you're considering where your business launches or where your business expands. And thanks for bearing with me today. You might notice that my voice is deeper than usual. I'm sure you can't imagine how I could have a mild cold as an Anchorage resident here in the middle of December. Next week, we're going to talk about would becoming a real estate agent yourself help you land real estate deals? Because, you know, in some states, it's not too difficult to get your real estate license. The week after that, we're going to talk with Tom Wheelwright again about how Donald Trump's tax plan will affect you. Thanks to the talented and connected Peter Zeihan today. We'll see you next week when I'll be back to help you build your wealth. Until then, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
You've been listening to Get Rich Education, telling you what the wealthy won't tell you about real estate and investing.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
flow real estate investors nationwide and worldwide, this is Get Rich Education's Keith Weinhold. Forbes has rated Memphis, Tennessee as the #1 cash flowing market in the world. Our good friends at Mid-South Homebuyers have been Memphis's premier turnkey real estate provider for 14 years with a stellar reputation and an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. Owner Terry Kerr was born and raised in Memphis. Yeah, he knows the market and has renovated and sold over 1,000 houses in the Memphis area. Find out what their many repeat buyers already know. Their houses are completely renovated, even come with a 1-year builder's warranty and a lifelong rental guarantee. They're a perfect fit for the first-time out-of-state investor or the seasoned investor diversifying their portfolio. Mid-South Homebuyers' friendly staff makes investing easy. Learn more at midsouthhomebuyers.com or give them a call at 901-217-HOME. The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.